Yep, woohoo. I love when technology actually works for me. So in 1881, the American president at the time was a guy named James Garfield. And about 4 months into office, an assassin came and shot Garfield in the back. Now, had they just sewed up the bullet hole and just left Garfield alone, historians believe he would have made a full recovery. But the doctors were like, oh, this is the President of the United States. There's no way we can just leave a bullet inside the President of the United States. And so within minutes of being shot in the back, he was surrounded by 12 doctors who began to use their unwashed, unsterilized hands to probe inside the bullet hole, looking for the bullet. When that didn't work, they began to take probes, metal rods, also unsterilized, unwashed, and probe inside. You can imagine how painful this was. Probe inside, looking for this bullet, which they were not able to find. Now, us being modern people, we all know what happened next. Mr. Garfield got a raging infection. Horrific infection. If you read the history books, the things this poor guy went through were awful. And he lasted for 80 days. He lost half of his body weight before finally succumbing to the infection and dying. Now, he didn't die from the assassin's bullet. He died from the well-meaning doctors. And I think we all know that there's a difference between wanting to help and actually helping, right? We've all probably had that experience, or perhaps been guilty of that ourselves. Wanting to help, but not actually giving any assistance at all. Genuine hope grows from more than our best intentions and our good wishes. For hope to take root, it must be planted in the soil of effective action. And so tonight, as we look at the story of the Good Samaritan, the most obvious difference between the Samaritan and the two other guys in the story is that the Samaritan did something. He recognized what needed to be done, and then he took effective action. The NIRV Bible says in verse 34, going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. And if you and I want to be hope bringers into the world, we need to follow the example of the Samaritan. The Samaritan was prepared to help. I think sometimes we miss the most obvious detail in this parable of Jesus. The Samaritan had readily available the items that were required to help the man who had been beaten. He was equipped. He had oil. He had wine. He had bandages. Now, this is not to say that he had some sort of Samaritan first aid kit, or that he was some sort of Samaritan first responder. I don't think they had them those days. But rather that he recognized what needed to be done and then provided what he had. Being hope bringers begins when we recognize a need and then understand that God has given us the ability to respond to that need. I don't know if any of you have seen this video. There was recently a video that went viral during a comedy show. A man suffered a heart attack. By the way, there's not many videos, which is the first incredible thing. Because we all think if someone suffers a heart attack, what are they going to do? Right? Everybody's going to get out their phones. But that's not what happened in this case. In this case, this man suffered a heart attack, and instantly, different people in the audience began to offer up their skills to save this man's life. You can hear on the video someone shouting, "I am calling 911," which is the U.S. way of calling for the emergency assistance. Another begins chest compressions, and yet another begins to take the man's pulse to see when they get the pulse back. When the woman who was doing chest compressions, which just so happened to be an emergency room nurse, When she gets tired, someone else steps in and begins doing chest compressions before them. In this way, the man was revived before emergency personnel actually made it to the scene. It's an absolutely incredible video. And I believe, like the people in the audience and the Samaritan, hope bringers spring into action because they know they can help. They have matched the resources, their skills, their abilities, their materials that God has given them with the circumstances in which they find themselves. Major Paul and I have this theory that whenever there's emergency around, God makes sure the right people are around. It's an amazing thing we have found time and time again. Once we were young lieutenants. Yes, we were young once. We were young lieutenants. We were traveling back on late at night from Minneapolis, Minnesota to Brainerd, Minnesota, when all of a sudden we saw headlights flipping towards us. Of course, we stopped. And thank God the car did not hit us. The car rested in the ditch. And we stop, and Major Paul, he looks at me and says, "Call 911." And he jumps out to see how the driver in the car is. The car, I kid you not, the car that pulled up behind us was an off-duty highway patrolman. The next car in line was a medical professional, was a doctor. First three cars, a pastor, a highway patrolman, and a doctor. The woman, she was bloody. They helped her get out of the car. Major Paul sat with her until the paramedics got there. But God made sure that those people were there at that time for that moment. And so hope bringers, we notice that there's a situation, and we notice that God has put us in that place for that moment. Hope bringers understand that God has placed them exactly where they are needed. They believe in divine providence over mere coincidence. We read in verse 31, by chance a priest came along. Now, we need to understand that by chance, in human terms, is not an accident in God's terms. According to BibleHub.com, the word sukaria, which is translated in our Bibles as chance, by chance, a priest came along, points to a moment that outwardly looks accidental, yet inwardly carries eternal weight. Luke 10:31 urges every follower of Christ to treat each unplanned encounter as a summons to manifest divine compassion, trusting that underneath every sukaria lies the purposeful hand of God. In the story of the Good Samaritan, there are 3 divine opportunities. But as a Gen Z person might say, only the Samaritan understood the assignment. Only the Samaritan recognized that he could bring hope and healing to a man who desperately needed it. Hope bringers are challenged to look at the world and see God's hand at work. They understand that their every interaction has the potential to bring them into situations and relationships which will further God's plan and purpose. Hope forces us to look at the world differently. An authority on the law asked Jesus, this story comes about because an authority on the law asked Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus answers this authority on the law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Love him with all your strength and with all your mind. And love your neighbor as yourself, and you will live. In response, the authority on the law says, "Okay, Jesus, well tell me, who is my neighbor?" And that's when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Who is the neighbor of this authority on the law? The Samaritan. Now, Jews and Samaritans despised one another. Jews considered Samaritans unclean and corrupt. Sometimes the neighbor that God calls us to love, the neighbor to whom we are called to bring hope, is not the person we expect. God's love and compassion working in us has a way of making those we despise those who are our enemies into our neighbors, those who we're called to love. William Barclay points out in his commentary on this passage that Jesus was challenging the authority on the law to not merely act like a good Samaritan, but to also like a Samaritan. Could an authority on the law, a man who had dedicated himself to following all of God's laws, bring himself to see a Samaritan, someone who did not follow God's law, as a neighbor? Perhaps I believe this is the most challenging message in this parable, because it's easy for us to turn the parable of the Good Samaritan into a nice story about helping people. But what if we allowed this story to dare us to see the world as full of neighbors? Instead of viewing the world as a place of opposition, a place full of enemies, Christ inspires us to see the world through the lens of the cross, where God demonstrated his love so that, in the words of Romans 10:13, whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. God and Jesus open the way for unlimited grace, unlimited love, and unlimited hope. Experts advise that in an emergency, we should never say, "Someone call for help." Because, experts tell us, that means that everyone will think someone else will call for help. So in an emergency, what you should do instead is to point to a person and say, "You call for help." And that's the best way to make sure that someone calls for help, to give that responsibility to a single person. The parable of the Good Samaritan, in a sense, Jesus is pointing to his followers, pointing to you and I and saying, you be a good neighbor. You be a neighbor. God has made a divine appointment for you today, for this time, for this place. It is no coincidence that we find ourselves in this exact moment at this exact location. And so Jesus says to us, you go and be a neighbor. God has provided everything we need to offer help and hope to a world that is desperately in need of it. And so God is saying, you go and be a neighbor. Through the power of the cross, Jesus Christ has opened the doors to heaven so that everyone in heaven and on earth and under the earth will kneel down and worship him. God himself has broken down those divisions so that we can go and be good neighbors.